So Donald Trump just demanded control of Canadian ports, not adjusted tariff terms, not a new customs cooperation deal, not a joint inspection framework, operational control. American federal officers with legal jurisdiction inside port facilities that Canada built. Canada finances and Canada governs. The demand came first through formal diplomatic channels, a State Department note to the Canadian Foreign Ministry outlining what Washington called bilateral port cooperation measures. Then Trump stepped in front of cameras and made it public. Canada's ports are handling trade that belongs in American ports, billions and billions of dollars going through Halifax and Vancouver because of very unfair arrangements made behind our backs. We need access, we need authority, and we need a fair share of the revenue our trade is generating in their facilities. Mark Carney responded within 4 hours. Official statement, 2 sentences. Canadian ports are Canadian sovereign territory. This conversation is over. 14 words. The shortest official response Carney has issued since this confrontation began. And the reason it was 14 words is that a longer response would have done something the demand didn't deserve. It would have treated it as legitimate. When someone demands the keys to your house, you don't write them a legal brief. You tell them no and you close the door. To understand why this demand was made, you need to understand what's actually happening at Canadian ports right now. Because the numbers don't just explain the demand, they explain the desperation behind it. Halifax, a port that underwent what was publicly described as routine infrastructure upgrades and has since become the primary North Atlantic logistics hub for a European-Asian trade corridor that routes entirely around the United States. Container throughput is up 61% year over year. 14 major global shipping lines have point lines that previously anchored their operations in New York, Norfolk, and Savannah. Customs pre-clearance at Halifax runs in under 4 hours through advanced digital processing systems. At major American facilities, the equivalent process takes between 36 and 72 hours. That gap is not a detail. That gap is a competitive advantage that compounds with every single shipment. Halifax port revenue has more than doubled since the corridor became fully operational, and a $340 million expansion funded entirely by operational revenue, not government subsidy, is already approved and underway. Vancouver and Prince Rupert are absorbing the surge in Pacific trade generated by the Pacific Atlantic Economic Compact and Canada's agricultural diversification agreements with 23 nations. Vancouver container volume is up 43%. Prince Rupert, which holds the shortest sea transit time from Asia of any port on the continent, is up 57% with an expansion plan that will double its capacity within 3 years. The Trans-Canadian Corridor is now a fully operational transcontinental trade route. Goods arrive from Asia at Pacific ports. They cross Canada by rail, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific. They depart from Halifax toward European markets, a complete east-west trade spine assembled piece by piece across the entire span of the trade war, moving billions in commerce annually entirely through Canadian infrastructure, entirely under Canadian customs jurisdiction. Montreal, the Street Lawrence Gateway, is reporting volume growth of 31%, handling increased European trade, relocated corporate supply chains, and agricultural exports flowing through the Great Lakes system. The aggregate number tells the full story. Canadian port revenue across major facilities has increased by an estimated $6.8 billion annually since the trade war began, not from one cause. From the accumulated weight of the agricultural diversification, the Pacific Atlantic Compact, the corporate migrations, the defense partnerships, each one added a new stream of commerce into Canadian ports. Together, they transform facilities that once served a mid-sized regional economy into globally significant logistics hubs serving a trade network spanning 4 continents and 2 billion people. And on the other side of the border, the mirror image, the Port of New York and New Jersey, the flagship of American Atlantic commerce, the largest port complex on the East Coast, has seen container volume drop 19% since the Halifax corridor reached full operational capacity. Shipping lines that rerouted to Halifax have not returned because the rerouting wasn't temporary. It was a structural optimization driven by faster processing, lower costs, preferential customs treatment under bilateral agreements, and freedom from the tariff volatility that makes commercial planning through American ports genuinely unreliable. Port Authority revenue projections built on decades of uninterrupted growth have been revised downward for 4 consecutive quarters. Infrastructure investments that were justified by long-term volume assumptions, berth expansions, crane installations, warehouse construction are now sitting in a market that is contracting, not growing. Savannah, the fastest growing American port before the trade war, has seen 3 major shipping lines defer or cancel planned route expansions. Norfolk, Charleston, Baltimore, Boston, every major American East Coast port is reporting declines in the international transit cargo category. The high-value cargo, the cargo that made American ports global hubs rather than regional unloading docks, that cargo has migrated to Canadian routing. On the West Coast, Long Beach and Los Angeles, the busiest port complex in the Western Hemisphere, for decades are reporting Asian trade volume declines as the Pacific Atlantic compact routes an increasing share of Asia-North America commerce through Canadian Pacific facilities that offer preferential processing for member nations. The United States is not a member of that framework. Seattle and Tacoma are losing Pacific market share to a competitor that operates inside a trade architecture they are structurally excluded from. The American Association of Port Authorities said it plainly in a public report with a directness the organization has rarely used before. The decline is structurally driven by trade policy consequences that have permanently redirected international commerce to competing infrastructure. The industry that runs American ports knows exactly what happened. The trade war did this. And instead of addressing the policies that caused it, instead of competing for the commerce, instead of investing in the infrastructure, Washington demanded access to the ports that were winning. The formal demand contained 4 elements, each one more audacious than the last. First, Joint Customs Authority, American Customs and Border Protection officers stationed inside Canadian port facilities with authority to inspect, delay, or redirect cargo, effectively giving American officials decision-making power on Canadian sovereign soil over cargo that Canada has already cleared through its own systems. Second, preferential berth allocation, guaranteed priority docking for vessels carrying American origin cargo at Canadian terminals, requiring Canada to put American commerce at the front of the queue at ports Canada built ahead of the trading partners whose agreements and commerce generated the growth in the first place. Third, and this is the element that produced the sharpest international legal reaction, revenue sharing, a demand that Canada transfer a percentage of port revenue and customs duties to the United States on the grounds that the growth was generated by trade diverted from American ports through what Washington called unfair Canadian practices. That framing is worth pausing on. The voluntary commercial decisions of thousands of private shipping companies that chose Canadian ports because the terms were better, were characterized as a form of theft requiring financial remedy. Fourth, regulatory alignment, a demand that Canadian ports adopt American customs protocols and inspection standards, which would, in the bitterest of ironies, destroy the processing speed advantage that attracted the trade in the first place. American customs averages 36 to 72 hours. Donald Trump demanded operational control of Canadian ports, not adjusted tariffs, not new customs cooperation, not joint inspection frameworks, full authority. American federal officers with legal jurisdiction inside facilities built, financed, and operated by Canada. The demand came first through a formal diplomatic note and was then made public, with Trump claiming billions of dollars in trade were flowing unfairly through Halifax and Vancouver and insisting the U.S. deserved access, authority, and a share of the revenue. Canada's response, delivered by Mark Carney, was 14 words. Canadian ports are Canadian sovereign territory. This conversation is over. That brevity was deliberate. A longer response would have legitimized a demand that was fundamentally illegitimate. When someone demands the keys to your house, you do not debate, you say no. The reason for Washington's desperation is clear. Canadian ports have surged during the trade war, capturing flows the U.S. once controlled. Halifax, now a primary North Atlantic logistics hub, saw container throughput rise 61% year over year, with 14 major global shipping lines rerouted from New York, Norfolk, and Savannah. Advanced digital customs preclearance at Halifax takes under 4 hours, compared with 36 to 72 hours at major U.S. ports, a decisive competitive advantage. Vancouver's Pacific volume is up 43%, Prince Rupert 57%, and Montreal 31%. As Canadian infrastructure absorbs trade from Asia and Europe through the Pacific Atlantic Economic Compact and agricultural diversification agreements, Canadian port revenue is increased by an estimated $6.8 billion annually, fueled entirely by private investment, efficiency, and strategic trade partnerships. Meanwhile, U.S. ports like New York, New Jersey, Savannah, Norfolk, and Los Angeles report declining volumes and revenue as high-value international cargo migrates north. Trump's formal demand contained 4 audacious elements: joint customs authority giving American officers decision-making power on Canadian soil, preferential berth allocation for American origin cargo, revenue sharing from Canadian ports, and regulatory alignment with U.S. customs protocols. Each would have undermined Canadian sovereignty, efficiency, and the very advantages that drew trade northward. International legal scholars immediately condemned the demand. It violated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, WTO principles on domestic infrastructure control, and, as one Georgetown professor noted, was the most extraordinary assertion of extraterritorial jurisdiction over Allied sovereign infrastructure since World War II. Diplomats and foreign leaders drew direct historical parallels to colonial port concessions of the 19th century, with Brazil's foreign minister explicitly noting, "We recognize this demand for what it is, the language of the 19th century applied to the 21st. Domestically, Canada's response carried not anger but quiet disbelief. Politicians, port authorities, business councils, and unions endorsed the refusal unanimously. Warren Buffett framed the U.S. demand as stage 4 of competitive failure: denial, imitation, aggression, then desperation. Demanding the competitor's infrastructure is the unmistakable sign that you cannot build it yourself. If America could have matched Canadian ports in speed, efficiency, and trade agreements, it would have done so. Instead, the demand was an admission of failure." The international reaction was swift. The European Commission reaffirmed sovereign control of ports. Japan called the demand unprecedented, and the WTO reinforced port state sovereignty as a cornerstone of global trade. The defining image of the trade war is now clear. Canadian ports, Halifax, Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and Montreal, surge at double-digit annual growth, built on decades of investment, innovation, and strategic partnerships. U.S. ports contract, losing the high-value cargo that once made them global gateways. When Trump demanded operational control, Canada responded firmly, memorably, and unambiguously. You don't get the keys to a house you didn't build just because your own is empty. The trade war's outcome is no longer speculation. It is visible in containers, cranes, and customs receipts.